It was late when we pulled up to the cabin. The headlights of our Suburban reflected off the darkened windows, briefly shining on the ominous trees that surrounded us. It had been a long driver, and the change in altitude was taking its toll. My parents were normally pretty lively, but I could tell they were beginning to get on each other's nerves. They never bickered, at least in front of us, but they were usually quiet. A slight drizzle started in the night sky, and we all jumped out of the SUV while grabbing our bags. Dad went straight for the cabin while we quickly made our way behind him. Inside, the new cabin was picture perfect, just like the AD said on Airbnb. It was more luxurious than rustic, but we preferred it that way. Normally, we would have stayed at the family cabin on my mom's side, but the forest fires over the summer had finally taken their toll. We were disappointed, but it was only a matter of time, and we knew that, however, this didn't help with our adjusting to the new place we were renting. Paintings of landscapes and majestic animals lined the walls, making this almost obnoxious, but that was probably me just being overcritical. The week at the cabin was always a treat everyone looked forward to. It was one of the few things that my family did religiously every year, aside from maybe church on Christmas. My brother and I scoured the cabin for our rooms. I ended up taking the loft, which sat in the nook of the A-frame that looked down into the rest of the cabin. Updated carpet as well as logged-styled furniture filled the room. In the corner was a dated TV with one of those VCRs built in, but nothing else around it. The walls were designed like logs. The roof angled somewhat sharply, and facing out the rear was a large window. I was able to look out and see the forest that seemed to engulf us. The moon was playing its part in adding a slightly eerie vibe, casting shadows amidst its pale light. I laid my stuff on the bed and glanced out, taking in the breathtaking sight. I turned to put my stuff away and noticed a small door outlined on the log-styled wall. It had a small brass knob that barely stuck out and blended in almost perfectly had it not been for the obnoxious lock that kept it closed. The lock looked old. The opening on it appeared worn, and the key must have been equally large and awkward. Everything in this cabin seemed new, or at least updated, aside from the TV in the corner, so it was strange to see something so out of place. I put my things away, paid the random small door no mind. Not much later, my mother called us from the living room, and we all slowly gathered from our separate areas. I don't know about you guys, but I am very hungry. Does anyone want to come with me to get food to bring back here? She asked. Seeing how this cabin didn't have Wi-Fi, and we were virtually off the grid, I volunteered. My brother and Dad were either too tired or not hungry enough to care, so we made it a girls' trip back into town. So, how do you like the cabin so far? Mom asked as we got buckled in the SUV. I mean, I like our old cabin, but this one is slightly nicer. It's newer, but I wish it had Wi-Fi, or at least a real TV, I said, trying not to complain. Yay, the old cabin was nice. It was much closer, but we got a screaming deal on this one. It's probably because it's in the middle of nowhere, but I guess that's the point. We drove out of the woods and back onto the road leading us into Gavin County. The radio softly played some kind of country music, and Mom went over the plans for the week, most of which were things not taking place at the actual cabin itself. We drove on the empty road, occasionally passing another vehicle, undoubtedly another poor family being forced to spend time together, I thought. The thing I liked about the old cabin was that there were other cabins nearby, some of which we were even friends, but out here, out in the middle of the woods, I felt so incredibly isolated. We drove down to town where the half-dozen lights of whatever businesses that were still opened glowed faintly. I feel like most small towns seem to have a Chinese place, which, unfortunately, this one didn't. But like every small town, it did have a gas station, a pawn shop, and an outdated post office, all of which were closed. There was one diner, however, that still seemed to be open. It had a few cars parked out front, which we ended up pulling into, considering we had no other options in town. The diner almost seemed to have a 70s style to it, but that probably wasn't on purpose. We walked inside, and low commotion could be heard in the fairly empty diner. An older gentleman standing behind the counter gave a brief smile and nodded to a booth. "Hope y'all are hungry," he said. "Indeed we are," Mom replied. We sat down and ordered. The man we assumed to be our waiter didn't write anything down, just nodded after each thing. "I'll get that ready for ye, right quick," he said, ducking back into the kitchen. We were both tired and, worst of all, hungry. A moment of appreciated silence fell between us. I could tell my mom was thinking of something to say to start a conversation, but the man returned too quickly with our food. "Y'all are from out of state?" he asked while placing our orders in front of us. My mom was taken aback. "Oh no, is it that obvious?" "It's not obvious," he smiled. "I saw your plates when you pulled in. So what brings you here?" My mom laughed. "Yay, we are just getting away from it all. Our family cabin burnt down last summer, so we decided to try something different." "That's too bad," he said. The man turned to leave before my mom awkwardly asked, "Any fun hikes here in town?" Trying to make the best of our situation. The man walked back over to our table while scratching his chin. "Fun hikes, huh? Well, we don't do a lot of hiking around here. Isn't safe unless you packing a firearm of some kind. Lots of bears and other things lurking around. This is more of a place you just drive through." He paused. "We do have the Horseshoe Museum, though, which I don't recommend." He chuckled. "Sorry, not much going on here." My mom's attempt to cheer me up failed miserably. "Dang, I'm sure we will find something," Mom replied. "I hope you find it before it finds you," the man said before dipping away to the kitchen. "Why are old people so creepy?" I whispered. "Oh, he was just having fun with us tourists. Plus, that's how old people talk." We ate our meal and the man came by once or twice to fill our drinks. Both times he was silent, just smiled. We paid our bill and walked out to the SUV. The drive back to the cabin was no less eerie than the first time. The dark trees lined both sides of the road, begging the question what else lurked inside. We made it back to the cabin around midnight. Time had gotten away from us. My dad and brother had gone to bed, but I could still hear noise coming from Eric's room. He was probably playing on his Switch or something. I went upstairs to the loft and got ready for bed. The loft was nice, but there weren't any blinds on the large window. It wasn't so much an issue because who would have seen me, but it was weird being able to look out into the vast woods, unsure of what was looking back. The next morning I woke to the warm sun slowly rising through the trees. It was earlier than what time I would have normally gotten up, but the light slowly creeping in made it impossible to go back to bed. I went downstairs to the kitchen to find my brother already awake. He was just sitting in the living room, playing more on his Switch. "Is anyone else up?" I asked, still whipping the sleep from my eyes. He glanced up briefly. Doesn't look like it," he said before returning to his game. "Good call, bro," I said, working my way over to the fridge. At the old family cabin, we normally kept the fridge stocked, but at this one it had slipped our minds to bring food. The fridge was empty. I wasn't starving, but I would need to get food soon. He'll just wait for Mom and Dad to get up, I thought. In the meantime, I racked my brain on what to do. I went back upstairs and got dressed for a hike. I wasn't an outdoorsy girl by any means, but I did love a good walk. The sun and all its glory was peering in stronger now. I went downstairs and outside. The morning air was brisk, but fresh with the smell of damp leaves. The cabin's exterior was neatly landscaped. A stone path led around to the back, which I slowly went on as I stretched. Around back was more of the same. Stones were placed neatly guiding me to the woods, undoubtedly leading me to a trail. I followed the stone path out into the woods, and the neatly placed stones eventually stopped at a basic dirt path. One much less cared for. A quick 20-minute walk couldn't hurt. I always had a rule that the second I could see a path, I would stop and turn around. No sense in getting lost in woods I was unfamiliar with. Plus, knowing my brother, he would probably forget to tell my parents I went for a walk. I walked a good 5 minutes when I remembered the conversation from last night. The old man at the diner recommended I have a gun when going into the woods. I stopped in my tracks. Ah, that's right, I sighed, totally unprepared if something were to happen. But then I remembered what my mom said. He was just giving us tourists a hard time. I debated briefly before continuing my hike. I continued my walking for another 20 minutes or so. Not only did the trail eventually end, but at the end of it was a weird sight. It was barely visible, but sitting just off to the left of the trail down a little ways appeared to be an old concrete structure. I like to discover things, sure, but I also knew better than to investigate a strange building out in the middle of the woods, at least by myself. Had Eric ever stopped playing Zelda, or I had one of my parents, I would have peeked inside, but being a young girl alone in the woods, no chance. That was until I noticed how dilapidated it was. I could almost see all of it from the outside. It was more of a frame of a large shed than anything. There wouldn't be much to investigate, as it looked more dangerous from a structural standpoint rather than some villainous hideout. The unassuming structure spoke to me, drawing me in like a wounded puppy needing attention. I stepped off the path. I can take a quick peek, I guess, I thought to myself. The hollow shed was only just a few hundred feet away from the trail. I would have to be severely disoriented to not find it again. The odds of the menacing bears that lurked in the woods were staying inside were incredibly small. A concrete frame stood, mostly eroded, and whatever remnants of the roof had been removed a long time ago, if ever existing at all. There were window frames, but no glass. As I got closer, I noticed a very strange sight. More so that the shed itself, hanging on a rusted nail just outside the doorway, was a large key. But to add to the mystery of this key was the weirdest thing dangling off of a chain connected to it. The best way to describe it was that it appeared to be a rabbit's foot, but the trinket didn't have any fur. The nasty-looking bone protruded out of one end and came to a point much like that of a talon or a claw. I didn't have a reason, but I picked up the key. Its weight was rather impressive for such a small item. I tried not to touch the gross-looking keychain on the other end. I was gonna put it back, but something caught my eye. Inside the concrete frame in the center of the floor was a metal hatch. The hatch itself was rusted and looked incredibly heavy. To my dismay, it was open and sat back at about 160 degrees, not quite touching the other side. I froze in horror. Two things immediately came to realization as I saw drag marks leading down and into the hatch, but also scratch marks on the inside portion of the hatch. I knew immediately that this wasn't a place I should be. Something incredible sinister was taking place here, but I couldn't be sure what it was. Not the slightest spark of courage or curiosity came forth. If anything, I was repelled by the sight. That was enough for today. The shock of seeing the strange bunker and insidious signs of foul play, I slipped the key into my pocket and backpedaled away from the concrete structure. I didn't want to take my eyes off the hatch, for fear of whatever lurked beneath sprung forth and dragging me down into the endless abyss below. I quickly found the trail, my nerves slowly calming down the further I got away from the cryptic hatch. I made my way back to the cabin. My mind wondered what mysteries were held beneath the metal hatch. A makeshift meth lab, a well, a bunker someone tried to build and deserted halfway through. My hunger was getting the better of me. My parents had better have been awake by now. It didn't take long for the cabin to slowly come back into view. I could see my room, aka the loft, a good distance away. Creepy to think someone could very well be able to see me, and I would have no idea. I made it back to the cabin and was delighted to see my dad cooking eggs in the kitchen. Eric was still a couch potato and didn't seem to have even moved from last time I saw him. I could hear Mom singing from her bedroom, still getting ready for the day. "Hey, Kay," Dad said, glancing up briefly from the eggs. I smiled. "Hey, Dad, making some for me?" I asked hopefully. I wasn't, but I can," he said. "That would be amazing." "So how was your walk?" Dad asked. "It was actually really good. I didn't see any bears, and there's a nice little path that leads pretty good out in the woods. I don't know why, but I debated on telling him about the hatch, like mentioning it would have caused a negative consequence or something. I didn't mention the hatch, but I mentioned the structure. That way I had some form of deniability of going close to it. I saw a little spooky shed building out in the woods I might check out later." My dad nodded. "Oh, sounds like a little family activity for later." Before I could respond, Eric shouted from the couch. "That sounds lame. We need to go to a lake like our last cabin." My dad and I shared a silent moment of judging Eric before dishing me up some eggs. By this time, my mom exited her room wearing workout clothes. "Did I hear something about a hike?" she asked. "Yeah, Kay. Said there was a little trail out back." I interrupted. "And there weren't any bears," I said, smiling. Mom smiled. "Oh, right. The creepy old guy from the dinner." She chuckled. "Well, I am ready." "What about you, Stephen?" Mom said, looking at my dad. "Oh, right now?" Yeah, sure," Dad said, somewhat off guard. "Kay, hike round 2? Check out the spooky shed." I glanced up from my eggs mid-chew. "Yay, no." "Cool parents only hike it is. See you guys in a bit." My parents left the cabin, and I finished breakfast before heading upstairs. I could see my parents through the window outside as they ventured deeper into the woods. The hike I went on didn't result in any sweat, so I stayed in my workout clothes. Out of the corner of my eye, the large out-of-place padlock caught my attention. I turned my head slightly and saw the outline of the door that blended in so well. Weird, I looked at the lock for a brief moment before an idea slowly came into my mind. It took me longer than it should have, but I finally realized that the lock looked to be of the same material as the skeleton key I found earlier out in the woods. I pulled the key from my pocket and felt the weight of the cold metal. The grotesque keychain dangled lifelessly, causing my skins to crawl. Ugh, I have to get rid of that. I walked over to the door and knelt down. I didn't even have the key in the lock before my heart began to race. It was as if I knew this would work. I inserted the key with odd smoothness and gave it a twist. A heavy click could be heard, and to my satisfaction, the lock clicked open. "Whoa," I whispered. I pulled hard on the door, which caught on part of the carpet. It was clear that whoever renovated this place didn't plan on anyone opening this door. I pulled harder, pushing my foot against the wall for more leverage, but the door only opened a few inches. Damn, the hard part of finding the key was done. I just had to open the damn thing. I pulled harder, but was only rewarded with a slight opening of a couple inches. I peered inside what little I could open, but was disappointed in not having a clear view. I stuck my arm inside, reaching around for anything, and to my surprise, I felt an opened cardboard box. It was heavy, but I pulled it towards the door. I couldn't pull the box through the door, but once I pulled it closer, I was able to reach inside. I started pulling random objects out of the box and through the small door. To my surprise, I started pulling videotapes that were old and had written labels on them. Some of the labels had titles or dates, much like any home movie a family would have made. All of the titles seemed inconspicuous, like Family Vacation 1 or Grandma and Grandpa Visit. Huh. I fished around more and ended up finding about 9 tapes in total. The tapes that had the dates told me these must have been filmed decades ago, sometime in the early 80s. Seeing how I was bored out of my mind, I picked up the tapes and took them over to the old TV that sat in the corner of the loft. I was fully expecting to be disappointed and that the TV was probably not going to work, but when I pressed the power button, the TV gave off a loud buzz as the screen slowly began to illuminate. I inserted the tape that was titled Family Vacation 1 into the TV as the screen continued to warm up, but the tape was halfway through the film and needed to be rewound. I got distracted and was content with watching where the tape was at. On the screen was a clearly dated timeline which seemed to take place in a small town. It was mainly just scenes of people walking around. After a few frames in, the cameraman seemed to focus on a family walking around what I assumed was Gavin County at the time, as they went about their normal day of vacation. It didn't strike me odd at first, as the scenes depicted a happy family eating in a restaurant and walking through town. However, all of these seemed to be at a distance. It wasn't until the family got into a red station wagon and drove away that I realized that whoever was filming wasn't with them. The scene cut quickly, and now the grainy TV was showing me a wooden landscape as the person filming was driving now. This only lasted for a few seconds before it quickly changed again. Now it showed a first-person perspective of someone walking in the woods, but they didn't seem to be on any type of trail. I wasn't sure at this point if these images were connected in any way. It just seemed random. That was until the last scene of the tape finally showed a cabin a good ways off, one much more dated and older than this one. However, I noticed something that made me uncomfortable. Parked out front of the cabin was a bright red station wagon. One I assumed was the same one the family had gotten into earlier. The tape ended, and a black screen filled the TV before automatically rewinding itself. I put in a second tape that was only titled with a date. This one had been rewind unlike the first. This one took place in a city. It was nighttime. Skyscrapers could be seen illuminated, and a handful of pedestrians went about their own way. The scenes in this video didn't last very long, as they only lasted for a few seconds, most of which were just empty buildings or parking garages. Some scenes had either a person or two, but it was clear that they didn't know they were being filmed. This tape only seemed to last no longer than 5 minutes, but that's all it was. Just eerie scenes of people unaware they were being watched in empty locations. I grabbed a third tape, this one titled My First Friend. I inserted the tape, and an image of an old house appeared on the screen. The house seemed run down, sitting out in an unkempt field of some kind. It was bright out. Again, the perspective was first person. So far in all of these tapes, I didn't get to see who was filming. This tape was one continuous shot. The person slowly approached the home, which was clear that it was abandoned. The front door had been boarded up. The scene slowly showed us walking around the house, filming in windows and peering inside. We turned the corner to come into the backyard and see that the back door is wide open. The person filming slowly approaches, and we can see on the brick steps a dark stain leading through the doorway. I began to get uneasy. We see the camera get close to the stain, but we are not able to make anything out of it. It then goes back to the first person, and we are led inside. Despite the home being abandoned, there is still furniture and appliances inside. However, it is completely destroyed, and clear that someone or some type of animal had once made this their home. Trash and leaves were scattered about the home. The stain could still be seen in some shots, and crying began to be heard from inside. The cameraman finally follows the stain, which leads to an open doorway. He pauses as the cries get louder. He then peers inside the doorway to see a set of stairs leading down into a dark basement. He takes a single step before the scene abruptly ends. What the hell were these tapes? I ejected the tape and set it with all the others. I made sure to lay them all out so I could see all of their labels. I saw a tape that was titled Family Vacation 2, which I assumed to be a continuation of the first tape. I hesitated. I wasn't sure what I was about to watch. My mind raced as I could only assume the worst. I found myself becoming more and more uneasy, but I inserted the tape anyway. The scene started with a morbid image of a dead deer on the side of the road. Its body was bloated, and clearly it had been impacted by a vehicle moving at high speeds. A stick could be seen briefly, poking at its dead body before the scene changed. It was more driving, but it was dark out. I could barely make out the silhouette of trees in the dim headlight of the cameraman's car. He pulled over on the side of the road, and the scene ended. The screen went black, but I could hear sounds of something being dragged through the woods. This was the first time I heard the cameraman speak. He swore softly as he grunted while doing something laborious off-screen. A light could be seen as the scene changed. We were outside of a cabin from earlier, but not terribly far away. The light inside reveals the family from earlier, but enjoying their evening, oblivious that this person was filming outside. They seemed to be laughing or talking as we sat quietly in the darkness. This went on for a while as we just sat still and watched. Finally, the lights from inside go off and the dragging sound continues. We hear something being dragged onto what sounded like wooden boards before the scene changes abruptly. It's morning time and we see the front of the cabin. We are behind the red station wagon and see the dead deer from earlier on the porch laying in front of the door before the tape ends. It had seemed that each tape I put in, it got more and more disturbing, more unsettling. I grabbed another tape, but I could only imagine the worst. It was titled Dinner with Friend. This tape was at the end of the recording, so I had to rewind to the beginning. This took a few moments as the screen was blue, slowly blinking, rewind as a whirring sound could be heard within. I was fixated on the screen, completely obsessed with this stash of nostalgic morbid tapes. The screen immediately displayed an image of a woman, gagged and bloodied. She was staring directly in front of the camera, sobbing. She was in some kind of dark room, with a very dull flashlight shined right on her face. "Oh my gosh," I whispered, putting my hand over my mouth. The camera slowly steps away, revealing her leg was chained to a concrete wall. "I want you to meet my friend," a soft, masculine voice said from behind the camera. "Maybe we can all be friends?" The camera then turned and pointed to the other side of the room, revealing a large unfinished basement, but one you wouldn't find in a house, more like some kind of abandoned building. Several concrete pillars stood, and the man shined his light in between, as if he was expecting something to come out of the darkness. You couldn't see the other end of the basement, but I was beginning to fear that the cameraman was the least of this poor woman's problems. You could hear the chain behind the cameraman move slightly, the woman's soft sobs continuing. "Richard," the man cooed, as if trying to coax out a pet from underneath a couch gently. The man began to chuckle. "I don't know if that's his real name, but I like to think that's what he'd like to be called. He doesn't like to talk." The light continued to scan in the dark before resting on a pale figure that could be seen briefly poking its head out from behind the pillar. The figure was at a distance, and the viewer was not able to get a good look, plus camera quality was incredibly poor. Just pixels of what I assumed to be something terrible. The woman, despite being gagged, began to scream terrified, muffled cries. She clearly didn't like what she saw. The man began to backpedal, clearly worried. "There he is," he whispered. "There's Richard. You get to meet him." The woman continued to scream, while tried to follow the cameraman, who was clearly distancing himself before the chain had reached its end. The man filming continued to back up, leaving the woman in between, himself and the pale figure lurking in the darkness. The frame then held still as the woman pulled on the chain frantically. The beam of the flashlight would occasionally shine on her, and then behind her as I expected to see something come from the darkness. To my absolute horror, I saw why the woman was so frantic. Slowly approaching from the darkness appeared to be something tall. It was hard to make out details at first, since the lens was not focused on him. I could tell by the pale outline that whatever this thing was not wearing any clothes, and it most certainly wasn't human. The creature slowly came into view, revealing a horrifying face. Skin pulled tight over sharp and ragged bones. Eyes sunk deep into its head, and teeth seemed to spill out of its mouth as it appeared to be smiling. Long arms reached forwards, grabbing hold of the chain with clawed hands, and began to slowly pull the woman towards him. The woman tried to pull back, but it was useless. Shh, the man hushed. Don't scare him. It will only make it worse. This only made the woman panic more. The woman slowly got pulled away, and I hoped to God that the tape would end like the others, but it didn't. The creature grabbed hold of the woman's arm and pulled it effortlessly off of her body. Blood spewed violently as the creature dropped her and began to take large bites of the removed limb, but it then did something that shocked me. Something even more than this horrible nightmare that came to life before me. It then held out the limb to the woman as she flailed on the ground in pain and stared at her. It extended its hand towards her face and sliced off the gag and held her flesh towards her face. "Eat it," the man whispered. "He wants to share with you." The cameraman then slowly inched forward as he tried to get a good shot of what was happening when the scene ended. I tried to mentally digest what I just saw. I couldn't believe it. I had easily just witnessed the worst thing I had ever seen. Why the hell were these tapes here, and who made them? I got up and removed myself from the tapes and went downstairs. I had to tell my parents. I had to tell them what I found and turn these tapes into the police. Eric had made his way over to the kitchen and was eating a snack. His Switch charging next to him. "Where's Mom and Dad?" I asked, somewhat on edge. He glanced in my direction but didn't look at me. "Good question. Still on that hike, I guess." I checked the time. I had easily just watched an hour of who knows what. There's no way that they were still on that trail. Maybe they found another trail or went into town without telling us, I thought. I checked outside and the SUV was still parked out front. I then remembered the hatch. I just prayed that they didn't do anything stupid, that they had enough common sense to leave the mysterious hatch alone, but things weren't adding up. I waited for them for another hour, but they never showed up. It was now late in the afternoon. It was going to get dark soon. I took the keys to the SUV and made my way over to the front door. "Eric, you should probably come with me. I'm gonna head into town and, get ice cream. You wanna come?" I had to lie. I knew if I told him the truth, he wouldn't believe me or just wouldn't listen. "Ice cream?" "Yeah, but shouldn't we wait for Mom and Dad?" I paused. No. You wouldn't let us go if they knew." He had a smile on his face, and I knew he was in. We went outside and got into the SUV and took off back into town. It took us longer than I remembered, but we rolled in around 4 p.m. To my surprise, despite finally having cellular data again, the town didn't have a police station. I called 911 and got an operator on the line, but when she asked me for the address, I completely blanked. The address? There's no address. It's just some cabin off the road heading into Gavin County, I said. The woman on the other line wasn't helpful. "Well, what's the emergency you would like to report?" A slight hint of sass in her voice. "My parents have been missing all morning. I don't know what to do." The woman paused before responding. "Well, let me see what I can do." I kept the woman on the line and we drove back to the cabin, still on hold as we waited for a response. Eric was upset about the ice cream, but I told him I'll make it up to him. I parked outside of the cabin and told him to wait here and talk to the operator if she ever got back on the line. I knew what I had to do. I had to look for them myself. I went into the cabin and found a large steak knife in the kitchen and a flashlight under the sink. For good measure, I went back upstairs and grabbed the key and put it in my pocket. I went out the back door of the cabin and headed on the trail that led deep into the woods. The trail was less pleasant than earlier, my mind still swarming with thought of what I had witnessed on that old TV. I just hoped that my parents gotten lost or something incredibly harmless happened, but it was so unlike them to just run off like this. I approached the end of the trail and peered down to the structure where the hatch was. I walked down slowly, unsure of what I was about to do. To my surprise, as I walked closer, I saw that the hatch from earlier was no longer open, but had been closed. The hatch had a similar lock on it like the one the closet had inside. I felt around and retrieved the key from my pocket. The long, gross trinket still attached. I inserted the key and twisted. The lock gave much more resistance this time, but eventually clicked open. I lifted the heavy hatch, which required most of my strength, and peered inside. Below was an old ladder that descended about 15 feet or so. At the bottom, I could see a concrete floor that had leaves and dirt scattered about. "Mom, Dad?" I called. No answer. I shined my light down. I guided the flashlight in hopes of seeing anything to better explain what this place was, but nothing. "This is so stupid," I whispered as I lowered myself down the hatch and onto the ladder. Once at the bottom of the ladder, a smell of mold mixed with something foul and offensive struck my nose. It was overwhelming. It took me a moment to catch my breath and focus at the task at hand. Once at the bottom of the ladder, I saw that I was now in a much bigger room than what I initially thought I was going to be in. Cement floors and walls extended in the other direction, making me unsure of what lurked beyond in the dark. I shuffled slowly in, stepping further and further away from the light that came in from the opened hatch. My heart was already racing when I heard a sound that made me regret everything. The sounds of tearing and breaking of bones could be heard not too far off into the darkness. I stopped and turned off my light, in fear that I just made myself known to whatever was down here. Before I could turn, a hand grabbed my mouth and pulled me away. I swung the knife hard behind me in the direction of the hand, but I missed. I tried to scream, but the hand muffled my mouth. I got ready to stab when I heard the whisper of a familiar voice. "Kay, you have to be quiet," my mom said, in a hushed and worried tone. She slowly released me and I calmed down. I felt a mixture of emotions, but aside from the overwhelming dread, I was relieved. I had found my mother, and she was still alive. My mind was now putting together what was going on slowly when she spoke. "We need to leave. We aren't alone down here." My blood ran cold. "Where's Dad?" I asked frantically. My mother paused. "Something took him. It took him into the darkness a while ago, and it has been making that sound for a while now. I don't think he is coming back, sweetie." I had so many questions. I was so confused. Why were they even down here? What took him? My mother got up and held my hand. "Thanks for opening the hatch," she whispered. By this time, the light outside had gone. We needed the flashlight to find the ladder. I turned on the light and shined it behind us when my mom whispered, "Wait." I panicked. I turned the light off, unsure of what to do. The ominous sounds from the darkness had stopped. A brief moment of silence hung in the odorous air. Whatever was down here with us was trying to listen, trying to locate us. I felt myself bolting backwards as my mother began to pull me to the ladder. Cries erupted behind us, sending waves of terror through my body. We didn't have to go far, but we both had to climb, and quickly. My mother went first, but quickly went up, and I followed impatiently. I could hear it coming for us. My mother cleared the ladder and reached down to pull me up. "Oh my gosh!" she cried as she could see it behind me. I climbed like my life depended on it, Mom reached down and lifted me up. I grabbed the hatch and slammed it down, but something obstructed it. I felt resistance pushing against it as I pushed down hard on the heavy hatch. A pale hand clawed at us, trying to grab hold of us to drag us down. My mother and I put all our weight on the heavy metal, knowing if we failed, we were both dead. By some miracle, the hand retracted back into the darkness, and we closed the hatch while locking it. We sat on top of it as we caught our breath with tears in our eyes. We could hear muffled screams beneath, as whatever that thing was now locked away. It was nighttime now. Our long walk back to the cabin was one of sadness and relief.